Chapter 3, Science and Faith, 4 Interactions. Many books have been written about the importance of relationships in our daily lives. Interactions with other people can make us healthier, happier, more productive, and make our life experiences richer. But how about science and faith? How does one relate to the other? In this unit, we will examine 4 perspectives on the relationship between science and faith: conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. This 4 views model is based on the book When Science Meets Religion by physicist Ian Barbour. Are science and religion enemies, strangers, or partners? The first model is conflict. In this view, science and religion are seen as enemies, perceived as opponents. Just like different football teams are rivals and fans cheer for just one side, say either the Redskins or the Cowboys, the conflict perspective promotes the idea that you have to pick one side, either a fan of science or a fan of faith, but not a supporter of both. Our society is permeated with the idea that science and faith are in conflict. This warfare view is often conveyed by the media. It is in the news, books, magazines, social media. Perhaps in part because conflict and controversy are what sell. However, the conflict perspective promotes an unhealthy and false dilemma of having to choose between science and religion. These realms are seen as incompatible. Take your pick. There are many problems with the conflict view, which reflect a mistaken understanding of the scope and nature of science, or of Christian theology, or both. Let's see in more detail some of these problems. Failure to recognize the close relationship between Christianity and the origin of modern science. As we have already seen in the first chapter, the Christian worldview made an important contribution to the development of science. The basic assumptions upon which the scientific enterprise is grounded find reasonable support in a Christian worldview. Many early scientists had theistic worldviews, including some with strong Christian beliefs. Another problem is the failure to recognize significant distinctions between scientific and religious assertions. Sometimes scientists use the authority of science to speak about ideas that are not really part of science. Sometimes theologians use their position to speak about scientific issues that are not really part of theology. For example, this quote by Richard Dawkins is a good illustration of a scientist using the authority of science to speak about ideas that are not really part of science. Human beings are simply machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It is every living object's sole reason for living. Science can't address purpose or meaning of our lives. Another problem of the conflict view is a failure to understand the limits of science and the applicability of the scientific method. An example is this quote by late astronomer Carl Sagan: "Because science's explanatory power is so great, once you get the hang of scientific reasoning, you're eager to apply it everywhere." As we have already seen, we can only apply the scientific method to the physical world. We can certainly apply critical thinking to other areas such as philosophy and theology, but not the scientific method. Again, the scientific method is limited to obtaining knowledge about the physical world. It does not have the ability to obtain knowledge or rule out the existence of the metaphysical. Limits of science should not be confused with the limits of reality. This other quote from Michael Shermer, founder of the Skeptic Society, is an example of failure to understand the limits of science. "I believe that the truth is out there, but how can we tell the difference between what we would like to be true and what is actually true? The answer is science. Science can certainly help us in finding truth. However, this truth is only about the mechanisms and processes of the natural world, not truths about purpose and meaning in our lives, good and evil, or metaphysics." In this quote, Michael Shermer expresses the idea that knowledge and truth can only be obtained through science. As we have already seen, this is a philosophical idea, a worldview called scientism. So we see again that what is perceived as a conflict between science and faith is many times a clash between competing worldviews. Another problem with the conflict perspective is a failure to recognize that scientific explanations are not a substitute for God, and that belief in God should not inhibit our pursuit of scientific knowledge. One can't replace the other. Unfortunately, throughout our society, there is a general widespread feeling that religious beliefs are outmoded and out of place in a scientific age, and that advances in science will eventually completely replace religion, filling all the gaps in our knowledge. This feeling is well illustrated by this quote published in Newsweek magazine. "The more deeply scientists see into the secrets of the universe, you'd expect the more God would fade away from their hearts and minds." The argument goes something like this. In the past, people used religion to explain phenomena that they could not understand. As science advanced and gave us an explanation, we no longer need the religious explanation. For example, some tribes would interpret the eruption of a volcano as the manifestation of a deity's wrath. But now science explains, well, the geological processes that lead to volcanic eruption. So we no longer need to invoke God to explain volcanoes. Science already filled this gap in our knowledge, replacing religious explanations. When God is invoked only to fill the blanks in our knowledge of the natural world, this is called the God of the gaps. There are serious problems with the God of the gaps kind of argument. First, as science advances and fills gaps in our understanding of the natural world, the God of the gaps gets squeezed into smaller and smaller spaces until it is completely obsolete, no longer necessary. Summarizing, if God is needed only to explain gaps in our scientific knowledge, then when those gaps disappear, so does the need for God. However, there is a serious flaw in this line of reasoning. To fill the gaps in our scientific understanding, we need scientific explanations. However, our knowledge of reality has many gaps that will never be filled by scientific explanations because there are many questions about reality that lie beyond the realm of science. So no matter how much science advances, it will never replace religious beliefs. There will always be the need for both scientific and religious explanations of reality. An important lesson is that believers, when defending their faith, should not make God of the gaps kind of arguments. Believers are on shaky ground when they use God as an explanation only where there are gaps in our understanding of the world. We should base our arguments on things that we do know, not in gaps of our knowledge. For example, what do the latest scientific discoveries that we do know tell us about metaphysical implications? Does the universe bear the marks of an intelligence? In the light of scientific discoveries, is it more reasonable to be an atheist or embrace faith in a superior mind that architected the universe and life? Another problem is that to use the concept of God to account only for unexplained phenomena is to limit God. Our need for God is not diminished as our understanding of nature grows. God creates in and through the processes of the natural world that science unveils. Now let's see, how does the Bible advise us? The conflict perspective, the either-or approach, is not biblically grounded. Jesus commands us to love God with all our heart, mind, and soul. This certainly does not mean alienating ourselves or automatically denying scientific findings. The Bible also encourages to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks us to give the reason for the hope that we have. What do you think this means for Christians living in a scientific age? Many top-level scientists also recognize the weakness of the conflict either-or approach. As Einstein wrote, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." betraying the idea that instead of competing, they can complement each other. Let's finish with an exercise. Read the quote below by physicist and atheist Bernard Lekind. When science finally solves the origin of the universe, the last reason for belief in the supernatural will vanish. A. Which of the four perspectives on the relationship between science and faith does this quote express? Answer: the conflict view. It expresses the idea that one replaces the other, either one or the other. B. This quote also expresses the idea that as scientific explanations fill the gaps of our knowledge, eventually science will completely replace religious explanations. What is this kind of reasoning called? Answer: the God of the gaps. C. Is our need for God diminished as our understanding of nature grows? No, definitely not. On the contrary, science has revealed scientific laws that describe many aspects of how the universe works. But science also raises many questions that cannot be answered by science alone. Why does the universe work in an orderly fashion that we can understand? Where did the laws come from? The mystery gets even deeper because science has revealed fine-tuning in these laws. Later in this course, we will learn more about this fine-tuning. So actually, as our understanding of nature has grown, our need to explain these evidences that point to a super intellect behind it all has grown, not diminished.